We welcome our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. Today is Business Morning. This Tuesday, the 22nd of October. I am boasting them for you. Let's get the show started. Nigeria currently battles a very serious fiscal imbalance, one of the strongest headwinds against the economy in the country's current recent history. I'll give you a very, what I call a very small or a snapshot of where we are at the moment. Nigeria is currently sitting on a debt portfolio of about 83 billion US dollars. That gives you about 25.7 trillion naira. The country's debt had ratcheted up 128% in the last 8 years. And we're currently just secured another $3 billion in multilateral loan for the power sector from the World Bank. That will be with effect from April 2020, according to the Finance, Budget and National Planning Minister. If you look at the budget 2020, Nigeria's debt servicing would be consuming 2.45 trillion of next year's 10.3 trillion naira budget headline. That's, according to some estimates, about 50% of our revenue. That's the average of what our debt servicing gulps aside the principal amount of debt. If you look at debt to GDP, some forecasts by Econometrics is looking at 26% debt to GDP ratio by the year 2020. Meantime, the government is also sitting on 36 states plus the Federal Capital Territory, where multi-billion dollars have been doled out as bailouts to state governments over the last 2 years. Because the states' governments or the subnationals themselves are sitting on a shaky fiscal balance, just as the federal government itself. Add that to the minimum wage, which is still being discussed. That is one big issue in the government's crosshair, as well as the petrol subsidy or under recovery, whichever terminology you choose to describe the current situation, which runs also into hundreds of billions of naira. So where do we go from here? How do we balance the country's current fiscal imbalance, and how do we manage the critical issues of debt servicing, debt portfolio, revenue, expenditure, our productivity, as well as our consumer spending, and grow the economy? All of this we're putting to Paul Alaje, who is a senior economist at SPM Professionals. He's live to us from our Abuja studios. Paul, good morning. Let's get this conversation up and running. So, good morning. Okay, Paul, sure you can hear me?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning once again.
Thank you. Now I can hear you very loud and clear. So, you saw that snapshot of where we are as far as Nigeria's fiscal imbalance is. So, what's your take in just about 30 seconds or 1 minute, the road we find ourselves into this, something close to a quagmire?
My take on this would be that if we continue in this trajectory where the growth rate of debt, which means the rate at which we increase our debt profile and the rate at which our economy the two do not balance, what we have in the coming period will be an economy that will be living in the air. No standard, no substance for which our economy is built. Our economy, if we live on that. Now, I quickly need to mention this because this is the quick argument. This is an argument people throw out there everywhere and say our debt to GDP rate is very low, 26%, 20%. Some even say that there are countries with over 100%. Yeah, yes, debt to GDP Paul, is one of the measurements people consider, but of course,
Paul, very quickly, we'll get to that in a couple of minutes. I'm trying to ask the question, how did we get to this point?
Yeah, we got to this point because we believe that we can also get resources from crude oil, and we forgot so quickly that we're a monocultural economy, an economy that depends largely on oil sales. For government, particularly public sector, over 80%, properly speaking, over 90% of government revenue come from revenue from oil, according to National Bureau of Statistics. So if something happened, if something negative happened or negative impact on crude oil, it's going to affect the entire public system. And if public life is affected, definitely it will have implication on private sector. So at times like that, when we are not having so much from public sector, we keep borrowing money over and over again, believing that one day all these projects will come together. And this is the danger of economics, where we assume too much that we'll be able to pay someday. Yes, we had the magic in the early 2000s where we had debt forgiveness. Are we going to have another debt forgiveness in coming period? I doubt if that will come anytime soon.
Okay, now you're touching some of the nerve, what they call the life wires about debt forgiveness and all of that. What we heard that your Obasanjo's administration handled was the Paris Club and a little bit of a smaller portfolio of the London Club. This time, we're not in the Paris Club. We're with the multilaterals, and we're heavy out there in terms of corporate debt as well as Eurobond. So, as you said, it doesn't look like we're getting any debt relief anytime soon.
It doesn't look like that. It doesn't look like that because I wonder if we consider the performance of this debt. Yeah, a lot of people a lot of officials have said that, yeah, we are servicing this debt, and because we service it, it's really not an issue. But my point will be that if we are to generate approximately 2.5 trillion naira from crude oil, and we are to spend approximately 2.5 trillion naira to service debt, what it means is that all again a major source of revenue, which perhaps is almost sure will be taking it from crude oil and will be sinking it into debt. Debt servicing. Debt servicing is a sunk cost. It's a cost you cannot recover because you are really not borrowing new loan and you are not spending that on financing. Rather, you are giving it to those who have given you money, either local debtors or, most importantly and most painfully, foreign debtor, which cannot have implication on our economy.
Okay, so Paul, if you're looking at this a snapshot on the screen right now, we ratcheted up our debt portfolio 128% in just 8 years. So this outlags the President Buhari's current administration. So this rolls all the way back to around 2010, 2011. And then sometime in between 2011 and 2014, we started borrowing to pay workers at the federal service, and a former finance minister, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, warned very softly then. Then we had about $20 billion in our excess crude account and all of that. So we had some fiscal balance, as it were, even if it's on paper, as it were. We had this money, but it all evaporated. So how do we get out of this quagmire? That's the flip side of this conversation.
Yeah, getting out of this quagmire is going to take tough decisions. For me, why do we borrow most of the time? Authorities will say we are borrowing not because we want to spend on capital expenditure. My point to authority would be that every last kobo generated from crude oil should go to capital expenditure. If it is 2.5 trillion naira we've estimated to generate from crude oil, let it go to capital expenditure. All other sources of income should go to recurrent expenditure, be it company income tax, be it VAT, etc., all manner of taxes and charges should go into personnel servicing, payment of transfer to different arms of government, judiciary and legislature together. Then government will know exactly what is it that they will generate, which is the hard work. Crude oil is not as hard as generating from for other non-oil sectors. So revenue from non-oil sector should go to should go to recurrent expenditure, I beg your pardon. That aside, there are other sources of revenue, such as flaring of gas in Niger Delta, which Nigeria has generated generated less and less from, other than what we should have generated. Penalties over the years are not, so many organizations have not paid their penalties and fines, which of course are based on agreement. You see a lot of community in Niger Delta that are suffering from some hazardous chemicals, if you like, which come as a result of extraction of oil within the region. Nigerian government should generate more revenue, because if appropriate fine and charges are not collected from these organizations, what we have is more of those issues happening around those areas. But I believe that from our estimation, our organization, over 2 trillion naira per annum is what we are losing by not considering some of these options very carefully. And if you look at what we are borrowing, over 2.4 trillion naira is what we are borrowing. And we have about 2 trillion naira on another hand that would have collected in charges and taxes on annual basis. Last year, one of the national newspapers actually published a report to show that Nigeria has lost approximately 6 trillion naira in the last 3 years by not collecting enough charges from oil, from extraction of oil within the Niger Delta region.
Paul, you're talking about taking the entire crude oil sales and what have you into capital expenditure and all of that. This is a tightrope for President Buhari's administration. It's a tough administration. The president himself is said to be a tough man. But do you think he has, and his administration has what it takes to take this very critical U-turn that you are recommending this morning? Do you think, what do you think it involves? Constitutional amendment? Do you think the legislature will go along with Mr. President and the executive branch? Do you think the subnationals, who are also bold in hand, cap in hand, begging Abuja to suspend the debt they are owing, and all the front and back that is going on about whether federal government is going to pay them, refund some of the monies they're spending to reconstruct and repair federal roads within their jurisdiction? It's quite a bit messy there. So how do you think this should be done? Do you think it's going to be an easy one? Do you think we can get it done in the next 3 years?
I believe President Buhari is a tough president, and I also believe he's a president that is determined. If he wants to do it, I strongly believe he will achieve it. Good news for Mr. President. The good news is that the legislature seems to align with Mr. President, unlike what he had, which was not a perfect alignment in his first term. The second term, we've seen that the legislature might even be supporting Mr. President, and you see the budget presentation, you've seen what happened during MTEF, and so on and so forth. So I believe that if Mr. President wants to take this decision, legislature will support him, and states, our subnational, have nothing to fear. It is not that they will not get allocation, it is just that allocation they will get must go into capital expenditure. A lot of people complain, particularly let's consider Lagos State. Lagos State have always have issue of traffic and roads that are not good enough. But what we are seeing in Lagos State seems to be unprecedented right now in terms of bad roads, etc., etc. Now, if federal government were to give Lagos allocation, proportion that come from crude oil must be tied to construction of roads or anything that has to do with capital submitted by Lagos. That will be good for Nigeria, because we now all see what state government actually have documented in their budget, particularly capital expenditure, to also know which proportion is going to be allocated to capital expenditure. The same applies to Kaduna, Sokoto, and all states of the federation. So states who are generating less than 1 billion naira a month, 1 billion naira a month, yes, we now need to rethink and find alternative to revenue generation other than coming to Abuja with begging bulls that lead. So what most of them do is what most poor people do. Most poor people, when they earn income, what they do first is to spend and say they will save the rest. Most of the time, nothing is left. But when you make it compulsory for them to spend on their capital expenditure, they will think of what to spend. Maybe perhaps some deputy governors may also be whole salary in the coming period.
Paul, one of the most very naughty issue and very noisy on the news street is that the cost that the money we spend for the National Assembly is humongous, one of the highest in the world, whatever that is and all of that. So do you think Mr. President should suggest to the leadership of the National Assembly, President of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, this is my proposal, that I want to cut the budgets of the National Assembly? Do you think the rapport that is currently existing between the executive and the legislature will still remain the same?
I think it will remain the same, because when you look at the amount we are talking about, out of 10 trillion naira, it's just
you think the National Assembly
talking.
will take it kindly with Mr. President if he says he wants to cut the budget of the National Assembly?
Yes, they should take it kindly. Why? I think they should take it kindly. And in fact, you may not necessarily need to cut the budget of National Assembly, if you ask me. Because out of over 10 trillion naira, we're looking at above 2 trillion naira. The remaining should come. My point is not to cut National Assembly's revenue. My point is that where you generate that revenue from should not be crude oil. Everybody likes the easy way out. Crude oil is the easy way out. It should be easy for all Nigerians, and the way it can be easy for all Nigerians is to allocate that money into infrastructure, into power, into education, into health. If politicians must spend money, it should come from other sources of income. You will see that we have better legislation, we have better executive, people we work. Legislature themselves, we recommend to the entire federation that we think we can make legislation secondary assignment. We want to keep our businesses, because government may not just be able to hold us. May not just be able to pay us, because nobody has been whole at the assembly level. And if they are whole at all, it's a month or two, compared with subnationals that have hold some of their workers 8 months salary, 9 months salary, in some states 12 months salaries. But when we see the reality that we need to find means of generating revenue, you will see that it will be faster, it will be better, and more of course income will come to the pocket of federation. And we put system.
Paul, we have about 4 minutes to wrap up this very interesting conversation, and we need to squeeze this into the mix. On the other hand, the man on the street, the taxes and levies and tariffs are going up, and the government will have to turn to the people to generate taxes. Been like that in the history of humanity. The man on the street is usually, tax is always #1 call for every government anywhere in the world to generate income. Then you have productivity that is so low and consumer spending retracting. How do you think President Buhari and his men and women should be able to balance this and get us out of the mess?
My advice is that President Buhari should walk the long way which all leaders of the world have walked through. That corridor is so long. We will keep collecting more revenue from middle class and the poor, of course, who cannot afford, in the case of Nigeria, if we don't make provision for foreign investment. Foreign investment not in buying treasury bills or going to debt market or buying Nigerian stocks, no. But coming to Nigeria to invest by manufacturing vehicles, by assembling television sets, by putting by manufacturing cameras, by putting so many things that Nigeria would love to buy abroad, coming home to do them. And how can we do this? If we make our policy, by the time first we create environment, we look at our core commercial centers, Lagos, Kano, Ibadan, Port Harcourt, and more importantly, Kaduna. When we put these states together and we assure them of security, relative security, because you cannot assure 100% security, of course, but power supply is a key conversation. Infrastructure is a key conversation. Support Manufacturer Association of Nigeria and operators within that sector. Foreign investor will come to Nigeria. There will be more jobs. To pay tax is not the issue. But when you are not earning enough and you have to pay government, disposable income shrinks, money to pay reduces, and what you see is that it may affect those in government at the ballot box in the coming period. So I would advise President Buhari to walk that long one. It starts with planning. Beyond the economic recovery and growth plan, we need a national development plan, which of course, our rolling plans of MTEB and strategy papers, we take their life from. It may be 10 years, it may be 20 years. By now, I was expecting those who are advising President to take his statement on June 12 that he wants to lift 100 million out of poverty, to turn that to a top policy document. How many new industries are we going to create? How do we bring, for instance, metro to our large cities so that we can create 2 million jobs in the first year? How do we ensure that our primary schools and secondary schools, both public and private, start consuming what we produce, fabric we produce locally? How do we produce, in fact, television, and so many other things locally. And if we must import, importers, I mean, those that are exporting to Nigeria, we compete, there will be a strong competition, not that Nigerians should be at disadvantage. Those are the things that lead people out of poverty. Those are the things that create jobs. Those are the things that put food on people's table. It's not just going to come by some of the programs we run, which nothing is wrong with, but they are not sufficient. I'm talking about SIP program. Nothing is wrong with those programs, but those programs are not sufficient in themselves because they will only sustain people for a while. But what takes people out of poverty will be policies that will expand the economy, that will make foreign investors to come in. But foreign investors will not come in if we appeal to them. President Obasanjo appealed to them. President Yar'Adua appealed to them. President Jonathan appealed to them. President Buhari is also appealing to investors. It's in Russia now. Perhaps we also appeal to Russia to come to Nigeria. Perhaps the appeal should be, how do we get Ajaokuta working? Which is the key conversation.
The point here is this, Paul, very respectfully here, you addressed in the green and white national colors. Can we put that back on screen? We need to go on break. Thank you so much, Paul. We love the tie, the national color, and the white shirt. Thank you so much. Now you are appealing to Mr. President to make some tough calls. Thank you so much, Paul. Let's leave it there for today.